attitudes of colleges and universities. And universities have become siloed areas of expertise is to host these colloquia. We attempt to weave together the college's gathered knowledge into the community through hosting these events, where we invite our institution's scholars to share their work with the larger community. And thanks to the power of technology, we can even broaden the definition of community to include places outside of just this geographical area. My hope is that as our speaker tonight shares his expertise with us, we might take this information and apply it in ways that improve the communities to which we belong. To help with that, there will be a question and answer time after Dr. Shana's presentation. Our speaker's office is wallpapered with various diplomas and honors. He received a Bachelor of Arts from George Fox University and has earned 4 graduate degrees. He has a Master of Arts in Theology and Marriage and Family Counseling from Fuller Theological Seminary, a Master of Divinity from Azusa Pacific University, and a Master of Arts and a PhD in History from the University of California, Riverside. He served as a Friends pastor for 30 years and is now in his 6th year, if my math is right, 6th year as Vice President of Academics at Barclay College. It's my honor to introduce a man I greatly admire, and I'm not just saying that because he's my boss, Dr. Jim Shana.
Thank you for those kind words, and I guess that is a good way to get kind words, to ask somebody who works with you to share them. So anyway, thank you. The perspective of a viewer influences and shapes what they see. That concept came into focus for me again this past weekend at my son's and now daughter-in-law's wedding. Everyone saw something, but I viewed it differently. Not only because I'm the father, but also I had the privilege of serving as the officiating pastor for the service. I had my own unique perspective. That is also true in historical studies. The perspective of the viewer influences and shapes what they see. As it relates to colonial Quakerism, a liberal filter predominates the scholarship of the era. My own lens is that of an evangelical Christian Quaker, providing another unique perspective. Today I've been asked to talk with you about a new view of historic Quakerism. It's been my privilege to present some of this information recently in North Carolina yearly meeting. And my intent at this colloquium is to share with you a few of the major findings from my doctoral research, especially those aspects that point to some relevant conclusions for Friends and for Christ followers in general today. So why colonial North Carolina? It's a good question. Most people know the traditional storyline of colonial Quakerism, but I would submit to you that it's a cartoon caricature, two-dimensional, not wholly false, but oftentimes lacking in depth and perspective of real-life contours and context. There is a wide body of scholarship, in fact, and at times it's overwhelming, that acknowledges the significance of colonial Quakerism in the northern colonies. The storyline goes something like this. The first Friends missionaries arrived in 1655, first in Virginia, then Mary Fisher and Ann Austin in Massachusetts. They came with their bonnets, their Bibles, their books, and their beliefs, and they were strip searched and banished. Without their books, with no converts. Not long after that, others came into Boston. They were heavily persecuted. Their ears were cropped. Fines, imprisonments, all of these things were their experience. Ultimately, several of them paying with their lives. 4 were hung in Boston Common. Historians have viewed them as either spiritual freedom fighters, championing the cause of religious toleration in the face of New England persecution, or as aggressive and persistent evangelists who refused to back down. But whether seen as heroes in pursuit of toleration or as obstinate preachers, an emphasis on their futile efforts and hostile encounters has cast Quakers into the role of outside agitators. They appeared as zealous foreigners, brave martyrs, antagonistic, mad missionaries, but in every case different and detached from normal New England life. The picture in the middle colonies appears at first glance to be different, comprised of wealthy and successful traders and business people who also achieved an element of political power. From William Penn on through into the 1750s. Frederick Tolles described this image well in his book Meeting House and Counting House. But even then, the Friends were viewed as a people in distinction, set apart by their peculiarities, outsiders even in the colony that they founded. This outsider image of Friends in early America forms a major component of the larger historiographical themes in Quaker studies. And it's this: the marginalization of Quakerism in general. Even the titles of some Quaker historical surveys, such as Rebel Saints or The Quiet Rebels, imply this fundamental assumption. Again, it's not that that image is wholly wrong, but it's not the whole story. It's sort of like building a jigsaw puzzle and realizing that several of the pieces are missing. The picture is incomplete. The story of Friends in North Carolina helps to fill out that image. Fewer historians have examined Friends in the colonial South, even less in North Carolina. Rather than living as antagonistic outsiders or people set apart, Friends in colonial North Carolina engaged their society dynamically and demonstrated a remarkable degree of evangelistic success. They carved out a distinct identity for themselves as a religious group in the colony while also maintaining active involvement in their wider society. As the dominant religious option for settlers during the early years of colonization, Quakers grew in both size and influence toward the end of the 17th century and at the beginning of the 18th. Although not without some opponents, especially among the Anglican missionaries in the early 18th century, Quakers in the colony wove themselves into the fabric of North Carolinian life rather than engaging as potential threats to it. An important historiographical question relates to the birth of Friends in North Carolina. Basically, the question has been, were they transplants or were they converts? And there are other kinds of implications from this that I don't have time to discuss, but just to notice this, that Friends hold the distinction of being the first organized Christian religion in the colony. Think about that again, the first organized Christian religion in the colony. Often when the story of Quakerism in North Carolina is told, the assumption has been that they were, for the most part, transplants from other areas, mimicking the storyline of other colonies. You know, Quaker immigrants in search of religious freedom, or at least in search of a better life. However, the evidence doesn't support that thesis. The first minister of any kind to visit North Carolina was William Edmundson from Ireland. He arrived in 1672, one of those who came with Fox that year to the colonies. After arriving in the colonies, he describes a rugged and difficult journey south in his journal. And let me read a portion of it to you. He said, "I traveled to Carolina from Virginia, and 2 friends accompanied me, it being all wilderness and no English inhabitants or pathways, but some marked trees to guide people. The first day's journey we did pretty well and lay that night in the woods, as we often used to do in those parts. The next day, being wet weather, we were sorely foiled in swamps and rivers, and one of the 2 who were with me for a guide was at a stand to know which way the place lay where we were to go. I, perceiving he was at a loss, turned my mind to the Lord, and He led me, and then I led the way. So we traveled in many difficulties until about sunset. Then they told me they couldn't travel no farther, for they both fainted, being weak-spirited men. I bid them stay there and kindle a fire, and I would ride a little farther, for I saw a bright horizon appear through the woods, which travelers take as a mark of some plantation. I rode on to it and found it was only tall timber trees with underwood. But I thought I perceived a small path, and I followed it until it was dark, and it rained violently. Though very weary, I durst not lie down on the ground, for my clothes were wet to my skin. I had eaten little or nothing that day, neither had I anything to refresh me but the Lord. In the morning, I returned to seek my two companions and found them lying by a great fire of wood. I told them how I fared, and he that should have been the guide would have persuaded me that we had gone past the place we had intended. But my mind drew to the path which I had found the night before. So I led the way, and that path brought us to the place where we intended. In other words, they had a tough time finding it. The journey to North Carolina proved difficult, but the friends' reception was quite different than the first Quaker missionaries in Boston. Edmundson and his companions found the homestead of Henry Phillips and his wife, who it turned out had discovered friends 7 years before, but had not seen a friend or engaged with them in all that time. They wept for joy to see the missionaries and invited all of their neighbors to a meeting. Edmundson reported that, quote, about the hour appointed, many people came, but they had little or no religion. How did he know? Because, he wrote, quote, they came and sat down in the meeting smoking their pipes. Although their appearance looked undoubtedly suspect at first, the first Carolina colonists readily accepted the friends' message. Edmundson wrote, in a little time the Lord's testimony arose in the authority of his power, and their hearts being reached by it, several of them were tendered and received the testimony. He said they desired me to stay with them and let them have more meetings. Two of the first converts were Francis Tomes, a justice of the peace, one of the highest local officials, and his wife, who hosted a meeting the next night in their home. And several more colonists then, quote, received the truth and abode in it. Edmundson was only there for 2 days, but he planted these seeds in good soil. They took root and grew. It was 6 months later that George Fox followed in Edmundson's wet footsteps. He and 3 unnamed companions traveled hard through the woods, bogs, and swamps, and he held his meeting in the home of a non-Quaker, another unreached person at that point, Hugh Smith, at which a small crowd gathered. Nathaniel Batts, the former governor of this area, received him gladly and agreed to assist him as a messenger in the area. George Fox spent only 18 days in North Carolina, but it was fruitful. He said the people were tender and much desired after meetings. Later, an Anglican missionary in the area, William Gordon, confirmed that, quote, it is true, some of the most ancient inhabitants after George Fox went over did turn Quakers, end quote. The immediate and positive response of colonial Carolinians suggests that they were a ready people, fertile soil. It was many years later, in 1929, that this plaque was erected to honor Edmundson and Fox's visit. It says, near this spot, William Edmundson, an English friend, held in May 1672 the first religious service on record in Carolina. 6 months later, George Fox, founder of the Religious Society of Friends, also visited this section and held meetings among the colonists. Here were the beginnings of the religious life of a great state. Fox maintained an interest in this region for many years. It was 10 years later that he wrote back to North Carolinian Quakers, referring to them affectionately as his faithful and tender friends in Christ. He had previously observed their homes and their plantations and their families and their way of life, and now he urged them to see beyond their earthly concerns in order to fulfill their religious potential. And so he used agricultural terms to describe a dichotomy between the temporal and the spiritual, acknowledging their commitment to outward fields and earthly duties, but told them to be sure above all to tend to God's plantations with a heavenly plow. He said they needed to live as responsible citizens, raising their crops and caring for the families, but also tending to their Quaker meetings, growing in their faith, and promoting their religious views among other colonists. He hoped that they would remain, quote, instrumental to open the eyes of others so that they too would become saved and come to know your Father which is in heaven. Evangelism was the heartbeat, not the hiccup, of early Friends in North Carolina. And that leads to this next kind of an observation about the spread of Friends in North Carolina. It was steady and growing. Some of the most interesting evidence that demonstrates the spread and growth of Friends actually comes from their opponents. You know, it's one thing when you are working for someone and you say something nice. It's another thing if you're against them and you make some similar comments. Well, that was true for the SPG missionaries, the Anglican Society for the Propagation of the Gospel missionaries, the SPG missionaries who were in that area. In 1703, the president of the province of North Carolina, Henderson Walker, penned a letter to the Bishop of London describing the colony's spiritual history. He explained that, quote, George Fox some years ago came into these parts, and through strange infatuation did infuse the Quakers' principles into some number of the people. He lamented that after Fox left their region, that the Carolinian Quakers followed in their founder's footsteps and persisted in persuading others to join them. They did and hath continued, he complained, to grow ever since very numerous. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of specific data to demonstrate the exact precise numbers during these years of the growth of Friends. In 1708, the best estimate that we have is they comprised about 1/7 of the population. At that time, the population was 21,000 people in North Carolina. Roughly 3,000 of them were Friends. In 1704, the Reverend John Blair, another Anglican priest, wrote to his supporters in England regarding this spiritual state of North Carolina. He said, the country may be divided into 4 sorts of people. First, the Quakers, who are the most powerful enemies to church government. The second sort are a great many who have no religion, but would be Quakers if by that they were not obliged to lead a more moral life than they are willing to comply to. He continued his assessment by talking about the third set of colonists as, quote, something like Presbyterians, led by a few idle fellows. And then the final group were the Church of England, were, he said, the fewest in number, even though he called them, quote, the better sort of people. So, interesting, far from the liberal notion of tolerant, universalist, and passive Quakers, one Anglican missionary thought that the Quakers inhibited his ministry's potential effectiveness. He said, quote, they doubled their efforts and contrivances against him whenever they learned that he was arriving in the colony. 1726, one more observation here, Richard Everard, and these are just a few, just a minor sampling of the kind of evidence. Richard Everard, another of the SPG supporters, echoed this decades-long lament, writing to the bishop in London, expressing his frustration at this persistent progress of Quakerism. He said that the colony remained, quote, a most heathenish part of America with no sect among us except for the Quakers who had continued to daily increase. They grew. It's pretty solid evidence, in fact. Well, another important part of evidence, of course, would be the Quaker documents themselves that demonstrated their spread. The records of many colonial, monthly, quarterly, and yearly meeting minutes still exist today. For my own dissertation, I made photocopies of over 7,400 original documents from the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And it's a marvel to me today that they allowed me to handle all of those. Thank you, Guilford College, for that blessing. They are some of the best sources of information for birth and death records, marriage certificates, and the spread of their meetings. The first minute on record is from 1680, Perquimans announcing a wedding between a couple of people at the home of that Justice of the Peace, that original first friend there, Francis Tomes. Pasquotank monthly meeting started in 1684, and the yearly meeting started in 1698, nearly 320 years ago. And by that time, they already had at least 8 monthly meetings and several other smaller gatherings. They spread throughout the area. So who were these people? Who were the Quakers? Well, they were common folk, as well as those in positions of power and influence. They were North Carolinians. In relation to the court system, they served as members of juries, as witnesses, attorneys, plaintiffs, defendants, petitioners, and like Francis Tomes, as magistrates and clerks of the various courts. At the Perquimans Precinct Court in 1704, Quakers filled 4 of the 5 justice positions. So, do you catch this? Far from being persecuted by harsh judges and a threatened legal system, as in other colonies, Friends were a part of the system. They also served as active politicians and burgesses in the Colonial Assembly. At one time, more than half of the representatives were Friends, demonstrating further their widespread involvement and commitment to leadership in colonial life. Their election victories demonstrated the popularity of the Quaker alliance with common Carolinians. One of the most noteworthy leaders among Friends during this period was John Archdale. He served 2 times as governor, once on an interim basis in 1685 and then later, about 10 years later. And he was known for his wisdom, discretion, patience, and labor as governor, that he produced peace, welfare, tranquility, plenty, prosperity, and safety. We'd probably like to elect guys like that today. This drawing is of his initial presentation to the Assembly when he was appointed governor back in 1695. North Carolinian Friends shared various similarities with other Quakers in other parts of the world. They did desire an evidence to desire to have unity with them, but they really remained largely at the periphery rather than the center of the Quaker circle, probably for many reasons. It was difficult to get to. They did not have quite as many visiting friends traveling there. They were woven into this fabric of North Carolinian life. In other words, they owned plantations, they farmed them, and bought and sold goods, which meant something else that separated them from at least some Friends in some other parts of the world. Like their non-Quaker Carolinian neighbors, they owned, bought, sold, and distributed African slaves. One of the first Carolinians on record who owned an African slave was likely a Quaker, William Simmons. He acquired Maria, a Negro transport, in 1680. In 1705, Isaac Wilson brought 3 new Africans into the colony, Negro Phoebe, Negro Pat, and Negro Maria. In 1756, 10 years after the visit of John Woolman, that is often noted by historians elsewhere, Samuel Fothergill said that Carolinian Friends, quote, have been a lively people, but he lamented that Negro purchasing comes more and more in use amongst them. They also bequeathed slaves to their heirs, and sometimes the future unborn children of slaves to their children. I can tell you that in my own research, these were some of the documents that were the most odd to hold. In 1762, Nathan Newby willed his plantation to his wife, but their 5 children would receive at least 1 slave each, with his 3 daughters dividing equally the remainder of the slaves, including the unborn child of, quote, Negro Judah, to his daughter Sarah when she turned 18 years old. According to the will records of this period, friends held about the same number of slaves as everyone else, about 3.7 slaves per owner, but 24% of Quakers owned slaves compared to only 12% of non-Quakers. Friends were an active part of their culture. While they thought that slaves could become Christians, they also viewed them at this time as chattel property. Rather than anticipating, normally when this story is told, it starts with the anti-slavery efforts. But rather than anticipating the anti-slavery advocates who would later free their slaves, Quakers participated actively in Southern society and used slaves to enhance their outward plantations. Friends don't, again, typically like to acknowledge these realities, historians or laymen, either one. But the discerning mind notes this: we dare not ignore the reality of slave ownership, and I believe that even helps to inform and create a greater understanding of the personal and economic cost that came years later when they freed their slaves, taking the lead amongst others in this country. The domestic life of Friends also reflected their wider culture, demonstrating the influence of Southern patriarchal values. Although they mirrored some of the customs of Quakers elsewhere, the context of North Carolinian male-dominated society informed their family rituals and their gender relations. There are many stories that illustrate this. One was Sarah Martin, a recorded minister in 1737, but not equal in the way that we would think of it today. Her husband had an affair while she was away in ministry in Virginia, and the husband with this other woman had a child. The husband was disowned from the meeting, but 2 years later, Sarah wanted to go back to Virginia, but couldn't because she needed her husband's approval. Ex-husband. He wouldn't give it. Then another man pleaded her case to the Friends' leadership, and she was finally allowed to go. Her story showed that even female ministers at this time served in a subordinate role to men in Quaker meetings and homes. Friends, they were a part of their culture. Contrary to the transatlantic community thesis proposed by some historians, the appearance of solidarity among Friends masked at least some regional diversity. Although Quakers in North Carolina attempted to establish a heavenly plantation in their colony, they were separated by others by geographic and cultural distinctions. So, why did they succeed? How did they grow? Let me offer to you several very brief observations. First, there was weak or no opposition. Often there was no educated clergy in the area to oppose Friends or their message, and no functioning established Church of England at that time. Financial concerns. The Friends, unlike the Church of England or other established churches, did not require the payment of tithes as a tax upon their constituents. Life course rituals. The Friends provided a kind of stability in the wilderness areas for colonists by performing basic functions, burials, weddings, and recording of births. They had simple structures. In accordance with the testimony of simplicity, the Friends didn't require elaborate buildings, which the Anglicans required, in order to have a real church. And that offered a whole lot of advantages for starting new churches. By the way, there are some today who still have hang-ups in starting new churches because they think you have to have the building, forgetting that the church is the people. Acceptable size. The Friends allowed people to meet in homes, did not need many attenders in order to legitimize the church meeting. Leadership. This may have been one of the biggest reasons for success. The Friends' meetings were lay-led. No clergy were needed, which allowed for faster multiplication. Since they paid no salaries, it didn't cost as much for a local meeting to get started. Roles for women. Despite my earlier comment, they did, in their context, allow women more leadership roles and responsibilities than anyone else, providing places for women to discover their gifts and to serve. Social dislocation. Many people were moving into the colony. Friends helped to provide new settlers with a place to belong and a sense of stability in the midst of their changing, sometimes lonely worlds. We know this is still true today, by the way. Social dislocation, when people are moving new into a community, when they have a sudden change in their life, when there's a death, when there's a wedding, when there's a new birth, when there's a social change, they are more apt to receive positively invitations for the gospel. Spiritual monopoly. Friends were the only Christian option available. So if colonists didn't participate with them, they had no place to go for worship or fellowship and spiritual support. Where are there other people who need Christ? Strategic evangelism. This wasn't an accident. It was a strategic, thoughtful response to need. And again, they started new churches, new meetings, new places for people to gather, to become enfolded into the movement. There are so many examples of this evangelistic heartbeat. One in 1709 that I find kind of humorous was when an Anglican, the Anglican leadership was upset with what was going on with the rise of Quakers, and so they hired a special teacher to come and to train the young people, the youth, in Anglican ways, only to be discouraged and frustrated when 6 months later they learned that the Quakers had actually proselytized him, and he had become an outspoken Quaker leader. And they said that he had joined with the Quakers' interest, which has proved a great stumbling block to many of our persuasion. The regularity of their lives, their hospitality to strangers, according to the 1731 observation by the governor at that time in North Carolina. In fact, let me say this again. He wrote that the regularity of their lives, hospitality to strangers, and kind offices to new settlers often resulted in their inducing many to be of their persuasion. Did you catch this? They actually cared if people became Christ followers or not, and they did something about it by being kind to people who needed kindness. Although not for lack of effort, Friends did prove ineffective at reaching some groups of people, Native Americans. When Fox was there in 1672, he met with many of the Native American leaders at that time, with Indian kings, he said, and their people, to preach the gospel of peace, of life, and of salvation to them. He explained that he wanted the knowledge of the Lord to fill that part of the world, which meant also with those native inhabitants. Again, 10 years later, he reiterated his message to Friends that had gone to plant outward plantations, to, quote, invite the Indians and their kings and have meetings with them so that they would not neglect making heavenly plantations in the Indians' hearts, and so beget them to God, that they may serve and worship Him and spread His truth abroad. He wanted them to evangelize Indians who would in turn help to evangelize the world. What a vision. We would call that raising up harvesters from the harvest field today. Well, the fact is there were very few Native American Quakers in these early years, and some historians have assumed that that meant that Quakers just weren't interested or that they didn't attempt. No, the historical record demonstrates they did make efforts, they just were not very good at it. And to be fair, cultural anthropology and ethnography was still a long way off at that time. So understanding missiological concepts, they found their greatest hearing with those who already spoke English and had some awareness of the English-speaking world. So, to draw this to conclusion, the Lord planted Quakers in colonial North Carolina during this period. They were not divorced from or antagonistic to their surrounding English-speaking culture. They were contributors to it, engaged in virtually every aspect of colonial life, for good and for bad, which helps to explain also, in some ways, their effectiveness in evangelism. They weren't outside agitators, set apart in a combative stance. They were tied with their neighbors, many of whom ended up becoming friends. So, 3 questions just to end with here today, bringing this home to us. They're really the what about you questions. Friends in colonial North Carolina engaged their culture well. How about you? Are you living missionally? How well are you engaging and connecting with your culture for the cause of Christ? Friends also in colonial North Carolina demonstrated kind offices to others, especially to new people. So how about you? How well are you demonstrating kindness and thoughtfulness to those that you know don't know Christ yet? Maybe when you go home, some of you to interact with people during Thanksgiving, or others that you know in your neighborhoods. How are we doing? How about this? Friends in colonial North Carolina made concerted efforts to evangelize. So when was the last time that you prayed for someone and then shared the gospel with them? Let me invite you to join us again here in 2018 in August for the National Friends Church Multiplication Conference for some inspiring and practical ways to give legs to this kind of vision, to be a part of a movement, because there are people who are praying today that God would pour out His Spirit in such a way that it gives birth to a multiplication movement in this country among evangelically minded friends not seen since those early colonial days or the late 19th century. We all have our lenses. The perspective of the viewer influences and shapes what they see. Could it be that if we look for it, that the experience of North Carolinian friends and others in context can help us to see how we can follow Christ more and make a difference in this world for Him?
Thank you, Dr. LaShawna. I'm curious, we're going to open the floor now for questions. If you have a question, if you just stand up, I'll bring the mic. Again, it doesn't boom anything, but that will be good for our video feed. Are there questions?
Why did the Quakers start freeing their slaves?
Why did they start to free their slaves? There doesn't seem to be one answer to that. They started principally in the 18th century, and many different reasons, most of them not economic. During the period when they were freeing their slaves, it was still economically beneficial to own them. They started freeing their slaves in the mid to late 18th century, evidently in part because of their growing spiritual convictions. So the influence of guys like John Woolman, who came a little bit earlier, he was quite frustrated when he visited there, did have an influence and did have an impact. They would free families. They actually ran into some problems, though, because it was not legal to free slaves. If you freed your slave during that period, then your neighbor down the street could claim them, because it was not legal to have a freedman or freedwoman in the area. So what they would do, interesting, the last North Carolinian Friends-owned slaves on record were owned by the monthly meeting and the yearly meeting. And they did that so that they would not be taken by someone else. So they freed them in all aspects of life, except the yearly meeting maintained paperwork. That's essentially what happened.
You argue that there were some unique factors that allowed Quakerism to spread throughout the Carolinas without becoming either antagonistic or marginalized. But you also mentioned that perhaps it is a revisionist perspective on Quakers as being isolated, kind of homogenous, so on, kind of Tolis, etc. Are you saying, or would you argue that perhaps the other perspectives around the colonies, kind of outside of the areas of power, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, etc., that perhaps the same thing was going on and perhaps there was a misunderstood, or was North Carolina unique?
It's a great question. The way that I argue this elsewhere is that this was an example of what was going on in other colonies. And so there's an outstanding study I would recommend to you by Jonathan Chu called Neighbors, Friends, and Madmen. And it's a reevaluation of what was going on in New England. He argues, similar to the way that I argue here in North Carolina, that the firebrands, the oppositional, the ones who were hanged that get all the publicity, were the tip of the iceberg. And below the surface of the water, you had scores of men and women in wider New England that people accepted, and that typical Congregationalist, Puritan New Englanders could distinguish between their neighbors and friends and the visiting madmen. And that this helps to, without that kind of understanding, there is no explanation for evangelistic success in those areas, unless we understand that there were some that people built bridges with and made connections with. And so it's a growing sub-theme in historiographical topics related to early Quakerism.
Yeah, would you say, I'm thinking of Edmundson's path, and the Lord became the guide for him to guide the guide and the others through. And then you also talked about the plantation of the heart, or something to that effect. How would you correlate those type of things with the unprogrammed worship that took place, and maybe even the development of people in the professional world?
I'm not exactly sure I'm going to answer your question the way that you're hoping or intending, but putting together clearly these early friends felt as though they were being led by the Lord. There was no question. So Edmundson's story is not an isolated one. It seemed to them like a divine occurrence, that they met up with just this right family that became just the right place that friends' message could spread. They had that kind of understanding and excitement and enthusiasm and zeal. And it was very spiritual in its orientation. As it relates to the form of worship, that was not always the same as we might think of the presence in the midst picture of Jordan's meeting house in north of London. Similar timestamp, or at least a little before that, but it seemed to be much more rough, a little more less placid and peaceful in some of those meetings at times. And they would have notations about warnings for children who are running in and out of the meeting house and causing all kinds of clamor. And so in terms of the form of worship, there were aspects that were different, and certainly there were many, like Edmundson-FOX and their own leaders, who were active in vocal ministry. But the key for that aspect was that they didn't have to have this established clergy before they could start these meetings. And so that spirit-led sense did seem to infuse that spread of the movement, very much so. Yeah. It had a dynamism with it that many of us long for today.
In regards to the slavery portion, you mentioned how this was rather unique for Friends since others seem to avoid that route altogether. Why do you think that was for the Carolinians?
Yeah, so again, in the region, slave ownership was not just an accepted practice, it was the preferred practice during that era. So we have to put our minds back into that era to really understand, not just the time period, but the geography, the context. This was, if you had money and you wanted to grow your farm and you wanted to do something, you needed to own slaves. It would be like today getting the next best tractor. That's the way it was viewed. What happens, though, and this may be a part of your story, I don't know for sure. I only speculate as to why historians often kind of skirt past that part of the story and jump very quickly to the storyline of Quakers freeing their slaves. Frankly, it's because it's embarrassing. It's painful. It's heart-wrenching. So literally, I mean, going through the will records of Quakers from that period, oh my. I mean, there were times I just wept as I'm holding these documents. And I had this, I don't even know how to say it, this deep kind of a sadness over that. And then a thankfulness that later that they ended up freeing their slaves and taking the lead on it. But I think we don't even fully understand the thankfulness and what was going on with the freeing unless we understand. If they didn't own any slaves, big deal if they freed them. You know what I'm saying? The fact that they own slaves is not good. It's shameful. There's no other way to say it. And yet it helps to understand the full contours of the story.
It strikes me also that one of the reasons that might be glossed over is that's hard to reconcile that reality with what we often talk about, the abolitionist movement.
Absolutely.
And it's really hard to imagine those two being realities.
Okay, this question may not be as heavy as the other questions, but you said something about the plaque that they put up. Was there like a movement to go around and put like Quaker history on the map, or is that just like, because most times you don't really hear about anything like that, but then this plaque just like, that's not like a big known like piece of history.
It's actually a great question.
So,
there are some weird locations that have some pretty prominent plaques, like that are hard to find, and then, oh wow, somebody put a plaque there. Same thing at Furbank Fell in northern England. You can't hardly find that place, just in the middle of nothing, and then there's this huge plaque there. So I don't know. I don't think that there was a concerted effort, but who knows? Maybe there were some in the early 20th century that wanted to make sure that, or something like that. At least some positive parts of the Friends story.
I was curious about some of the you've talked about how they've been kind of enmeshed in the culture at the time, and I was curious if you, in your opinion, if there were things that they surrendered to be able to be a part of the culture that were significant Quaker distinctives. Significant, obviously, being up for definition, but things that you think mark Quakers as we understand them that help the Quaker movement have an impact. Were there things that you think North Carolinian Quakers laid aside that maybe they shouldn't have or that were significant?
Laying aside the Quakerism part?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, honestly, one of the biggest is what we were just talking about. So, about slavery. Friends in other places came to this realization that they should free slaves before North Carolinians. And so that would be one of those parts. It's hard to say were they giving up that part of Quakerism. The way it really played out sequentially is more that they refused to give up that part of their societal life in order to get on board with the rest of what was going on with Quakerism. I don't know if that makes sense, but that would be one of the more prominent ones. There were other things that are a little more difficult to put your finger on, things like speech patterns. It seems as though they, as North Carolinians, fit just in their North Carolinian life. And so it's difficult to know if they practiced plain speech in quite the same way. There does seem to be evidence that there were attempts, and some moving in from out of the area, they were still English speaking, so there was some of that. Clothing would be another thing. Because they were far removed from Philadelphia and some of the other places, Amazon.com didn't exist. They couldn't just, get it delivered to their home. And so their clothing, but in their dress, again, they were dressing like simple folks that fit into their culture, which when you go back actually to, again, 17th century Quakerism in England, that was the genesis of the idea of Quaker plain clothes, was not to be an oddity, but to dress like the common person. And so in that sense, I suppose, I've never seen someone argue this, but perhaps that would be an argument that someone could make.
So beyond the slavery issue, which is a big issue, there's nothing. I'm hearing nothing that would have watered down the impact of the message.
Yeah, that would be the most prominent of the kinds of things in terms of their message. The ways in which they served as bridge builders, as connectors, was pronounced in North Carolina, maybe more so than other places, because they didn't have that outside antagonistic agitator that some of the other places did. So that would be another kind of thing.
At the economy of scale that Quakers had in their plantations, and I don't know if they were smaller plantations compared to the rest of the society, what was the economic impact of the freeing of the slaves? Did they face financial ruin, bankruptcy, or just slightly less successful?
Yeah, it seems as though the economic sacrifice was pronounced. It was huge. I don't have any actual data to show to what extent that there might have been some who essentially lost the farm, that type of thing. That would actually be an area that's worth some additional research. It underscores that blending of lots of slaves and then not as many.
Could you speak to the mass immigrations that took place later from North Carolina to other parts?
Just a little bit. That was outside of my focus in my research, but I do know a little bit of it. So North Carolinian friends, little by little, did end up migrating moving west, and the path, you could say, ends up coming through here in the sense of from North Carolina to Ohio, Indiana, from Ohio and Indiana to Iowa, from Iowa to here, and actually from Iowa kind of to several places, through Kansas, and then later from Kansas to Oklahoma, and then into the middle part of California and into the Northwest, basically on the West Coast. In all of those places, there are people who can trace their family lineage back to friends in North Carolina.
I'm sorry. I want to be mindful of time, and so I know a few of you still have additional questions. I would encourage you to talk with Dr. LaShawna. We're having a reception if you at the conclusion of this in the cafeteria. So we would invite you guys to migrate over there. And again, if you have questions for Dr. LaShawna, please feel free to ask him after this. I'd like to. First of all, can we thank Dr. LaShawna again for his presentation? And then I would like to just conclude us with prayer, and then we'll feel free to head over to the cafeteria. Heavenly Father, we're thankful for the opportunity to come here and freely engage in these ideas. We recognize with great humility the opportunity we have to share the history of evangelism through Quakers in this country. It's humbling to be a part of that stream here at Barclay College. We pray that you would continue to guide us, that we would continue to be mindful of your calling us, and we pray that you would bless each and every person here this evening. We ask this in Jesus' name, amen.